If you thought this summer's heat had finally settled down, the Weather Prediction Center has some news for you. Their own extended forecast discussion, updated this weekend, is headlined in plain language: hazardous heat to settle down across the south next week. And the Climate Prediction Center just expanded that risk zone even further, adding the southwest into their extreme heat outlook for the coming 10 days. So today, I want to walk you through exactly where this next round is headed, how it connects to the heat we've already dealt with this summer, and why the southwest getting added to the risk zone matters. Make sure you're subscribed before we get into it, because this pattern keeps evolving and I'll have updates as it firms up. Let's start with the transition that's happening as I put this together. As of the Weather Prediction Center's Thursday discussion, dangerous heat was still gripping the north-central U.S. Guyans, with an upper ridge parked over the western and central states, driving hot conditions across the northern and central plains. But that discussion also flagged the beginning of the end for that particular round. Shortwave energy moving into the Midwest and Great Lakes, feeding into a northeastern U.S. upper trough, was expected to gradually suppress that ridge and push a cooling front through, bringing real relief to the northern tier early this week. That trough was also expected to kick off rounds of rain and thunderstorms from the Great Lakes to the east coast as it moved through. The same unsettled pattern I've been tracking in recent updates. So if you're in the northern plains or upper Midwest, the worst of this particular heat should be easing about now. But, and this is the entire point of today's video, easing in the north does not mean easing everywhere. The heat isn't disappearing, it's relocating. By Saturday, the Weather Prediction Center's extended forecast discussion had shifted its entire framing. The headline for the period running from Tuesday, July 21st through Saturday, July 25th reads, "Hazardous heat to settle down across the south next week." Their own overview states plainly that very hot and moist conditions will focus over the south next week, as northern tier shortwaves and moderating surface fronts continue to focus rounds of locally heavy rain and strong to severe thunderstorms from the Midwest and Great Lakes into the east. Some of that lead activity over the south and southeast may be fueled by Gulf and tropical moisture streaming north, which, if you saw my last update, connects directly to the low-odds Gulf disturbance I covered, since that same moisture source feeds both stories at once. Meanwhile, out west, the forecast discussion notes that ample monsoonal moisture will continue streaming from the southwest and intermountain west into the Rockies and then the plains, fueling enhanced showers and thunderstorms as a closed upper high shifts toward the southern plains. That closed upper high is the same feature the Climate Prediction Center has been tracking for days now, a genuinely persistent piece of the atmosphere that's been anchoring this entire pattern. Here's the update that makes this round worth a dedicated video rather than just an extension of what I've already covered. The Climate Prediction Center's most recent probabilistic hazards outlook expanded its slight risk of extreme heat specifically into the southwest. That risk zone already covered much of the central and southern plains, the middle and lower Mississippi Valley, the Tennessee Valley, and the southeast for the entirety of week 2 of their outlook. But the southwest is a new addition in this most recent update, not something that had been flagged with the same confidence in earlier outlooks. The mechanism behind that expansion is the same closed upper-level ridge I just mentioned. The CPC's own discussion describes anomalous mid-level ridging persisting over the western and central continental U.S. through much of week 2, with a closed 594 decameter contour remaining parked near the Four Corners region. For anyone not used to that kind of language, that's meteorologist shorthand for a strong, stubborn dome of high pressure sitting almost directly over the point where Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado meet. And when a ridge like that holds in place rather than drifting off, the region underneath it just keeps compounding heat day after day. The CPC's discussion adds one more detail worth flagging. Normalized 500 hectopascal height anomalies are forecast to run 1 to 2 standard deviations above normal, and they specifically note this is happening at the climatological peak of summer, meaning this isn't just an anomaly relative to an average day. It's an anomaly on top of what's already the hottest stretch of the calendar year. That combination is exactly the kind of setup that tends to produce the most dangerous heat index readings of an entire season. I want to spend a second on why adding one region to a forecast map is actually a meaningful update rather than a minor tweak, because it's easy to skim past that kind of detail. Forecasters don't expand a risk zone into a new region casually. Doing so means model agreement has increased enough, and the underlying atmospheric signal has strengthened enough, that they're now confident enough to put an official designation on an area that wasn't included in the previous update. In practice, that means the Southwest, Arizona, Southern Nevada, Southern Utah, and New Mexico in particular, should treat this as a genuine escalation in confidence about renewed extreme heat, not background noise. This also matters because the Southwest was already dealing with heat dome number 2 earlier this month, when Phoenix and Tempe held at or above 110 degrees for multiple consecutive days. A region that already absorbed one serious heat event this summer getting flagged again for a second round, on top of whatever cumulative strain that first event already put on infrastructure, health systems, and honestly, just people's patience with the heat, is a genuinely different story than a region seeing its first heat risk of the summer. It's worth reinforcing the connection between this heat pattern and the Gulf moisture story I covered previously, because the WPC's own language ties them together directly. The lead activity over the south and southeast in this outlook may be fueled by Gulf and tropical moisture streaming north. The same broad moisture source associated with the low-odds tropical disturbance I discussed in the eastern Gulf. That doesn't mean the heat and the tropical system are the same event, but it does mean they're drawing from the same reservoir of warm, moist air, which is part of why forecasters are watching both pieces of this pattern together rather than treating them as unrelated. This is also the mechanism behind why heat index values tend to run so much higher than the actual air temperature in this specific setup. When southerly flow off the Gulf pushes moisture-laden air north underneath a strong ridge, dew points climb, and that combination of high heat and high humidity is exactly what produces heat index readings that can run 10, 15, even 20 degrees above the actual thermometer reading. That's the number that matters for how dangerous a given afternoon actually is to your body, not the raw air temperature. Putting the geography together, the central and southern plains, the middle and lower Mississippi Valley, the Tennessee Valley, the southeast, and now the southwest are all under some level of extreme heat risk through the rest of this week and into the following week. That's an enormous stretch of the country. Realistically, a band running from Arizona and New Mexico, across Texas and Oklahoma, through the Mississippi Valley, and into the Tennessee Valley and southeast states, all dealing with some version of dangerous heat at the same time, even if the exact severity and timing varies region to region. At the same time, the WPC's forecast calls for rounds of locally heavy rain and strong to severe thunderstorms moving from the Midwest and Great Lakes into the east during the same window, meaning the heat and severe weather stories are running in parallel again this week in different parts of the country, the same way they have for most of this summer. There's also a slight risk of heavy precipitation, specifically flagged for the Southwest, the Central Great Basin, and the Central Rockies for this coming Friday through Sunday, along with a separate slight risk for the lower Mid-Atlantic and Southeast over that same weekend window, meaning even within the heat-affected zones, some areas could see a genuine mix of dangerous heat on some days and heavy rain risk on others, rather than one uniform dry, scorching stretch straight through. One more detail from this outlook worth knowing. Forecasters have flagged the possibility of rapid onset drought developing across portions of the Dakotas. That's a distinct hazard from the heat itself, but it's related. A region that just went through a heat dome and is now transitioning into a drier pattern can see soil moisture and vegetation conditions deteriorate quickly, which matters for agriculture and wildfire risk in that region, even after the most extreme heat numbers have passed. If you've been following along this summer, you've now heard me describe essentially the same underlying sequence multiple times. A ridge builds somewhere, produces dangerous heat under it, then shifts, handing the heat off to a new region while the previous one gets genuine relief. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a sign that anything unusual is happening beyond ordinary summer atmospheric dynamics. But the frequency and intensity with which it's happened this particular summer is worth noting. This is now the fourth distinct round of serious heat risk since late June. The eastern heat dome around the 4th of July, the western and north central heat dome through mid-July, last week's Gulf Coast and Southern Plains round, and now this expanded south plus southwest round arriving on its heels. Underlying all of this, confirmed back in June, is an El Niño pattern that forecasters said could strengthen into what's being called a super El Niño as the year progresses. Climate scientists have been clear that El Niño conditions, layered onto the general warming trend, raise both the frequency and the intensity of heat events during a summer like this one. That's almost certainly part of why this year has produced such a persistent parade of heat domes, rather than the more typical pattern of one or two major heat events spaced out across the whole summer. For anyone in the newly expanded risk zone, the Southwest specifically, along with the central and southern plains, the Mississippi Valley, the Tennessee Valley, and the Southeast, the guidance is the same as it's been all summer, but it bears repeating given how many consecutive rounds this region or neighboring one has already been through. Treat the heat index, not the air temperature, as your real danger signal. Limit strenuous outdoor activity to early morning or evening hours. Hydrate consistently through the day, rather than waiting until you're thirsty. And check on elderly neighbors, people without reliable air conditioning, and anyone with a chronic health condition that heat can aggravate. Heat remains the deadliest weather hazard in the U.S. on average, ahead of tornadoes, hurricanes, and lightning combined, precisely because repeated, unglamorous heat events like this one don't generate the same urgency as a single dramatic storm. If you're in a region that's already been through one or two rounds of serious heat this summer, it's worth paying attention to something less obvious: cumulative fatigue, both physical and logistical. Air conditioning systems that have been running hard for weeks are more prone to failure exactly when you need them most. Outdoor workers and athletes who've been managing heat stress on and off for over a month are operating with less of a buffer than they had back in June. And households that stretched their budget to cover elevated electricity bills during the first couple of heat events may be feeling that strain by the third or fourth round. None of that shows up in a temperature forecast, but it's a real part of what makes a summer like this one harder than any single heat wave in isolation. I'll keep tracking how this round evolves, particularly whether the Southwest's newly expanded risk zone holds or intensifies as we get closer, and whether that Gulf moisture feeding into the south ends up doing anything more than fueling heat and scattered storms. For now, if you're anywhere in this expanded risk zone, take it seriously, especially if this is your second or third round of the summer rather than your first. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you soon. Stay safe out there.